Hello everybody, hello from sunny Dawlish. Well, no it's not, it's a very grey and cold Dawlish, but welcome to first of my historical musings. And I thought I would start in the dead centre of Dawlish, which is next to the churchyard, and right by the oldest building in Dawlish, which is lovely St Gregory's Church. Now the sandstone tower that you can see is the oldest part of the church, and it dates back at least to the 14th century and possibly even to the 12th century, because it's thought that although there was a church built here in the early 1400s, that church could well have used an earlier tower, because that is a wonderful piece of construction. And it has been at the centre of Dawlish since that time. And it has been a religious building on this site for probably another 1,000 years on top of that, going back to the 6th century, the time of St Gregory, a pope who was a missionary and visited Britain, and it was his influence really that brought Christianity to the area and meant that there was probably, or there has been, a religious building on this site since the 6th century. Well, actually where I'm standing at the moment is was in somebody's back garden, because until just before the First World War, there was a little row of cottages here. I'm in the Remembrance garden, which was built just after the First World War, but just before the First World War, the row of cottages that would have been just to my right here burnt down. The story is that the tenant in one of the cottages returned after a night out in the Swan Inn, much the worse for wear on cider, took his nightlight up the stairs to go to bed, fell over, passed out, and set the cottage alight, and that burnt down the other cottages as well. I don't think anybody died, but it meant the end of the cottages. The First World War came, so they couldn't be rebuilt after the war. They thought, well, a remembrance garden would be wonderful for Dawlish, and this is where it is, and this is where the war has, or the wars that we've had since then, have been commemorated on a yearly basis. So this wonderful granite stone cross commemorates all those people from Dawlish and the surrounding villages who have died in wars from the First World War, the Second World War, the Falklands War, and other wars as well. And it is very fitting that we've got such a wonderful memorial right next to our St Gregory's Church here. And just behind the camera there in the corner, there is a headstone that is dedicated to Bill Millin, who was the bagpiper who went up the beaches of Normandy during the D-Day landings and piped the British soldiers ashore. And he lived in Dawlish till the end of his life, which was right up until this century. And what a famous chap. In the museum, his bagpipes are there, some of his belongings are there as well. A lovely old gentleman, Bill Millin. Right, well, right beside the walls of the church now, and I'm just leaning here on the Dawlish Saxon cross, or it's a stump of a cross really, but it has been here in Dawlish, we reckon, for about 1,500 years. Whenever I pass it by, I always just give it a little tap and make a wish, but this is the oldest monument that we know of in Dawlish. Right, I'm standing here at the newest part of St Gregory's Church, and when I say new, it's 1875, was when the extension this end was done, because church services in those days were attended by everybody in the town virtually, and the growing population had outgrown the size of the church. There was a second church built in 1850 right down in the town centre. We'll talk about that later, St Mark's Chapel of Ease. But St Gregory's Church is the parish church and was so important to everybody's lives. So in 1875, the Hoare family of Luscombe Castle donated money to build an extension out this way, and they had to demolish the old tithe barn, which was where the farmers brought their corn and crops to be tithed or to be taxed, and also to be sold on as well. But because of the extension to the church, Unfortunately, that had to be demolished at that time, and there's no record. I've never seen a photograph of it. Right, well, we've just moved around slightly. We're on the west end of the church now, just beneath the church tower. And I don't want to tell you too much more about the church because there's so much more to talk about this little part of Dawlish. Because when I said earlier that it was the dead centre of Dawlish, it was. This is where the original village grew up, and grew up at least 1,500 years ago. It was a community living here, or a settlement living here, because they had moved down from the hills or from Little Holden, where there was a settlement up there at Castle Dyke. There are several reasons why the settlement was built here, not least of all because of the protection. It's protection from pirates who sailed up and down the coast. Slightly later it was the Vikings, but before that there was Huns and barbarians. We're away from the coast as well, so the east wind, the easterly storms didn't quite reach here. There was more protection here. This is the lowest point on the river, or the brook, the River Dore. You could ford the river here. You could ford it with a cart, and this part of Dawlish was known as Dawlish Ford. There was fish in the river, there were fish in the sea, so from that point of view there was plenty of food. There was woods all the way around, forests and woods, and so the hunting was good. You had deer, you even had wolves at that time, but you had deer, you had rabbits, you had all sorts, and so therefore food in the woods was plentiful. You had nuts and mushrooms and all sorts of things that you could gather from the woods. You had the timber there that you could build your buildings with, and although we don't know whether they were cob and thatch or cob and reed cottages, i.e. mud and thatch, or whether they were wooden cottages at the time, or wooden huts, because there's no trace left. The first religious building here in say 550 AD, we think, is probably as early as it went. We don't know whether that was wood or whether that was stone or whether that was mud built, but we can only guess that at that time mud and reeds were easily accessible. Stone wasn't so easily accessible, so the chances are it was either mud or it was wood, or a mixture of the two. And between the 550 and the 1100s, when the first stone-built church was, there would have been many little religious buildings built, because they wouldn't have lasted that long. We remember to think that that's 500-600 years. There would have been several buildings here, and any remains, if they were wood, no remains at all, but if they were stone, might be underneath the present St Gregory's Church. There might be foundations of an earlier religious building. We don't know, we never will know. And you can see how the stone, or how the church has grown over that time, and how out of proportion the stone tower is now. And there are churches around. There's one at Kenton, there's another at Ken, there's Powderham Church, where there's still the sandstone churches, which are all in proportion with each other. But because Dawlish overtook particularly Kenton in importance, Kenton going back to the 1300s was an important village, because it was the home of the Earls of Devon at Powderham Castle, and Dawlish was a very insignificant little hamlet at that time. There was two little settlements. There was Dawlish Ford, as I mentioned, and a little bit further down towards the sea there was a later settlement which was called Dawlish Strand, and that's where the fishermen used to live. It was mainly agricultural workers who lived at this end, but the whole church really now is out of proportion compared with, say, Kenton or Powderham Church, where they're the original churches still. Right, well, here we are standing beside the family mausoleum of the Hoare family, who own Luscombe Castle. Luscombe Castle was built in around 1804 by Charles Hoare, of the banking family, the London banking family, who decided that this was going to be his family seat. And I think that really helped Dawlish to develop as a holiday centre, because people thought, oh, well, if someone like Charles Hoare or the Hoare family are going to come to somewhere like Dawlish, then perhaps we ought to visit there as well. So I think that was a little bit of an influence to bring people to the area. And I think the Hoares have had a lot of influence on the town itself. As I mentioned, St Mark's Chapel of Ease, which was built in 1850 down on Brunswick Place in Dawlish, well, a lot of the money for that was by public subscription, but also from the Hoare family as well. So when the Hoare family put money towards extending the church in 1875, they were very much Church of England, and I think they felt that the name St Gregory's, and St Gregory was a pope back in the 6th century, that perhaps that wasn't the right name for a church at this time, and they rather insisted, I think, that the name should be changed, and changed it was to St Michael's. And it remained St Michael's until the 1820s, and it was rededicated to St Gregory at that time. And I've got a feeling as well that because travel had got easier at the start of the 20th century, that the parish church in Teignmouth is called St Michael's. So you had this juxtaposition and confusion between St Michael's in Dawlish, St Michael's in Teignmouth, and it was decided to change the name back to St Gregory's. Now, such was the influence of the Hoare family, and their castle is just up the hill from here. It's about half a mile up their private drive. It was built, as I say, in 1804, but Charles Hoare did acquire Luscombe Farm, and that was just over the other side of this building here, which is the mausoleum, the family garden of remembrance for the Hoare family. And there's some beautifully tended graves in there, lovely Gothic arches here and the pillars. We've got a lovely old original stone gate here. It's a lovely little private area which is always quiet. There doesn't seem to be birds singing around here. It's always just a place that if you want peaceful contemplation, you come here and just stand and think about the people who are buried here, stand back and look at the church and think of the people who have entered the church. And it's been the centre of Dawlish for, well, since the 6th century, and that's 1500 years or so. It's a long time. Right, well, here I am stood by the main gate into the church at the south side, and I am just leading into what I call the dent in the wall, and there's a kissing gate here. And I always ask people why there's a dent in the wall here. Well, back in Georgian and Victorian times, ladies had their great big hooped dresses, and to come through the gate, then we had this nice little semicircular piece that they could move through comfortably with their dresses on. I haven't actually put a dress on to try it, but I'm assured that it does work. Right, well, that's the end of our little talk for today, but next time we will be down in what I call the town centre by the bandstand, and I will tell you about how and why Dawlish grew from a little fishing community centred on the church here into a thriving Georgian holiday resort. And after that we'll do the coming of the railway, the expansion of Dawlish into the 20th century. Got a lot to tell you, and we'll do that over the next few weeks. But thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon.